Erneut ein herzliches Willkommen zu Musica Sacra International live aus dem Modeon Marktoberdorf. Es folgt nun das Atelier des Ensembles Zekher. Das Ensemble besteht aus 3 Personen. Tina Frühauf, Musikwissenschaftlerin, Jürgen Geiger, Organist und Nicola David, Gesang. Sie repräsentieren bei unserem Festival das Judentum. Das Atelier wird von Professorin Dr. Tina Frühauf alleine gehalten. Sie wird uns mit Hörbeispielen die Rolle der Orgelmusik in der jüdischen Kultur erläutern, insbesondere mit Blick auf Deutschland. Auch dieses Atelier wird in englischer Sprache sein und Sie können uns während der Veranstaltung Fragen in unserem Chat stellen. Wir freuen uns, dass Tina Frühauf eigens aus New York angereist ist, um Teil unseres Festivals zu sein. Zur Einstimmung hören wir aus der Organ Sinfonia No. 2 Holy Days and Festivals von Hermann Berlinski. Once again, a warm welcome to Musica Sacra International live from the Modeon Marktoberdorf. Now follows the workshop of the Ensemble Zekher. The ensemble consists of 3 people: Tina Frühauf, musicologist, Jürgen Geiger, organist, and Nicola David, vocal. They represent Judaism at our festival. The workshop will be held by Professor Tina Frühauf alone, who will introduce us into the role of the organ in Jewish culture with a special view on Germany. This workshop will also be held in English, and you are welcome to ask us questions in our chat. We are honored that Tina Frühauf has traveled especially from New York to Marktoberdorf to be a part at our festival. At the beginning of the workshop, we hear from the Organ Sinfonia No. 2, Holy Days and Festivals by Hermann Berlinski.
Dear audience, you just heard an excerpt from Hermann Berlinski's Sinfonia No. 2, Holy Days and Festivals, composed in 1957. The excerpt was from the first movement, the prelude for Rosh Hashanah, It's a fitting piece for this moment, as the evening of Monday, September 6th, marks the beginning of the Jewish New Year. On Rosh Hashanah, the anniversary of the creation of Adam and Eve, we celebrate God's reign over us and his creation. As such, this holiday is closely related to the motto of this festival, Our Earth. There's much to be said about this brief excerpt I played. Composed by the Leipzig-born Hermann Berlinski long after his emigration to the United States, the movement significantly opens with a trumpet call, reminiscent of the shofar or ram's horn, calling the people to solemn assembly. It uses intervals playable on the shofar, and the trumpet call returns throughout as a call to prayer and a reminder of the ritual of blasting the shofar. After the initial fanfare, a section marked to be played as funeral march appears. It vies and competes with the shofar blasts, as if burying the void of nothingness and calling the world into creation. The period of the high holidays is also known as the Days of Awe. This work is not much of a happy new year, as the prayerful preparation not only of a new year, but of a new life. This piece represents a tiny sliver in the world of Jewish musical expressions in the synagogue, the home, during festivities, and in daily life. Given the dispersion of Jews all over the world, the music of the Jews of Bukhara differs, for example, from Syrian Jews. Yiddish-speaking Jews created their own unique repertoire, and Sephardic Jews created their songs in Ladino. It would be impossible to introduce you to the world of Jewish music in one atelier. Thus, allow me to stay close to home and celebrate with you 3 important anniversaries. The first being the anniversary 1,700 years of Jewish life in Germany. The second being the 200th anniversary of Louis Lewandowski's birth. And the third, the organ as the instrument of the year 2021. As you will gather, the organ, although hardly associated with Judaism, can serve as a lens to gain insights into other areas of Jewish culture, including prayer song, art, and other subjects. That we can experience the organ in Jewish culture is special, and here's why. Following the Roman destruction of Jerusalem's Second Temple and its renowned music in 70 Common Era, the rabbis imposed a national state of mourning. Musical instruments and certain types of vocal music, such as choral music, were prohibited in worship service as a sign of perpetual mourning. So though this ban was not fully enforced and qualified by interpreters of the law, Jewish musical expression was severely curtailed. An exception is the aforementioned shofar, the biblical wind instrument made from a ram's horn. It had many different functions and was also part of the full orchestra that played in the temple. It was the only instrument allowed in the synagogue because of its non-musical significance. It is blasted on the New Year and the Day of Atonement. gather that it sounds much more raw than the trumpet call that we heard in Berlinski's prelude. And that's due to the nature of him using an organ stop that is in tune, while the ram's horn is a ritual instrument. I want to say also a note on the visual example that you are seeing here. It is from a Mahzor, that's a prayer book specifically from the High Holidays. And if you are tuning in from the region, you might want to know that this was actually made and painted in southern Germany in the late 13th century. In the Middle Ages, if you look closely, in Central Europe, apparently it was custom to stand on a stool with one foot while blasting the shofar. The history of the organ in Jewish culture takes its course only in early modernity. Previously, the instrument's existence in Jewish context was subject to speculation. The Bible mentions the ugaf, commonly translated now as the organ, although semantically ambivalent, occupying divergent meanings. Similarly, the oldest treatises of the Mishnah and the Babylonian Talmud name an enigmatic and debatable instrument controversially identified as the organ, the magrefa. Scholars contest its identification as a musical instrument, and there are a lot of ideas of what it could be. Beginning with a man named Yochanan Isaac Alemanno, a 15th century philosopher and a biblical exegete who lived in Italy, the organ entered the intellectual mind. He heard in Mantua the blind organist Konrad Paumann playing and vigorously documented it in writing. Others followed writing about the organ, and from the 13th to the 17th centuries, the organ also began to appear in Yiddish Bible translations and in prose. Yiddish authors emphasized the important role that portative and pipe organs played in Solomon's thought, in Nebuchadnezzar's court orchestra, and in the Second Temple. In parallel, the organ entered art. Here on this slide, you see King David playing the organ, and he's being called an organist. This is an illuminated miniature from a Christian Bible, ownership of King Wenceslav. And in that time, the organ slowly established itself in the Christian milieu, but the relationship to the temple in this image shows really the connection to Judaism. The next example brings us right to the Jewish milieu. And here you see an excerpt from another prayer book for the High Holidays, the Heilbronn Mahzor, which stems from the late 14th century. And the organ embellishes the text of Psalm 59, verse 16. I will sing of thy power. Indeed, I will sing aloud. And the organ here suggests that this singing happens in the powerful way by being supported by the powerful instrument of an organ and being supported by through accompaniment. From the Renaissance on, the organ appears almost exclusively in Jewish iconography of Central Europe. This Siddur, a prayer book for daily prayers, is from the collection of Rabbi David Oppenheimer, who resided in Germany, and this dates from 1471. It is unique for its musical imagery. Look closely, and you might be able to gather from the image that there are at least 10 medieval instruments. One of them is the organ. But I want to speak first kind of broadly about the other instruments because it's kind of interesting for the context. The image, first of all, references Psalm 150, which details how God should be praised. With a shofar, which by now we know, the nebel, the kinnor, a tov, a machol, minim, ugav, and 2 different tzeltzelim. Some of the instruments are associated with the Levites, others with common people. As you see, there is a group of 9 musicians, and they illustrate the word panel, Hoshana, save I pray, which begin the Hoshanot, the hymns chanted during the week-long holiday of Sukkot, the harvest festival. Asher ben Isaac, who made the book, made it for the use of his family, for whom music may have had a special significance. Now on this slide, you see kind of better what's going on with all these instruments. And if you look towards the top, not all the way to the right, but kind of off-center, you will see the organ. What's also quite nice for this image is that it relates again to the festival motto, Our Earth, because it clearly shows how musicians of different ethnicities and religions, Christians, Jews, and Muslims, clearly distinguishable by their outer appearance, attire, and instruments, they are depicted in one frame. The composition of musicians possibly relates to the theological concept that the holiday of Sukkot is the messianic end of days for every nation. The portative organ is played by a young man with blonde curls and medieval headgear, and it suggests that it relates to Western Europe. On one of the last pages of the Oppenheimer prayer book, we find the organ once more. And you will be not able to see it on this slide, but I first want to introduce you to it conceptually. This is a highly decorated page, and it features two acronyms. The first one is Aramaic, and it marks the end of the book, and the lower portion features 4 letters in Hebrew, and that's the acronym for Blessed is the one that gives the tired strength. A blessing from the morning prayer. That acronym seems really appropriate at this very moment, consumed by the hard work that went into this elaborate siddur. The scribe probably wants to thank God for the fortitude he has given him to assure completion. There are lots of other images in this siddur which are very charming to see. But now we come to the organ on the next slide, on the close-up. Now look towards the bottom, and you might be able to decipher it. This illumination shows a small portative organ. Because the illumination is tiny, it's about 2 millimeters high, there's very little detail in the portrait of the instrument and how it's being played, but still, it's there. The significance of depicting organs and other instruments in the manuscript lies in its representation from an Ashkenazic perspective, yet one that is clearly conversant with images and their meanings in non-Jewish cultures in which the scribe artist seems to have lived or seems to know about. Whether the depictions can be considered evidence that the organ was used at the time cannot be determined. The first iconographic document depicting an organ actually being played in a synagogue is this breviary from the Lobkowitz family, dating to 1494. They lived in Bohemia, and this illustration cannot be quite matched with any synagogue that existed at the time, but it shows a small organ, possibly a positive, being played in an ensemble with drums and a pipe known as Rauschpfeife, quite an unusual combination. The occasion appears to be of secular nature, rather than being a formal synagogue service. 100 years later, in 1594, a synagogue was built for the congregation of the Prague ghetto by a man called Mordechai Meisel. He was a celebrated Prague financier and philanthropist, and he sponsored an organ that was being played every Friday evening together with an authorized synagogue orchestra. Thereafter, we know of occasional appearances of organs. There have written iconographic sources from Prague that actually allow us also to kind of see a different role for the organ, not just in the synagogue, but also in ceremonial functions, such as in 1678, when Prince Joseph I was born and a big procession took place, and the organ was being played by the Jewish community, a portable organ, and the community was being part of the procession. On the next slide, we actually have a tangible example. This is another procession for another prince, Leopold I, imperial heir to the throne. So the Prague people really like to do these processions, and this one shows a public procession only of Prague Jews honoring that birth. The organ you cannot see on the slide, but on the next one, you will be seeing a close-up under number 19, and there you actually kind of see that it was a portable organ being played by an organist in procession. This visual evidence is also supported by written evidence, notably by a German scholar called Johann Jakob Schutt, who offers factual details about the instrument. He said about the procession, afterwards came a new organ, which was made by Rabbi Meir Mahler, cost above 400 gulden. Schutt also mentions a second organ heading the procession of the Torah, and he includes a copper plate graving of the 1716 procession. However, this image does not depict the organ. The celebration of arrivals of rulers and coronations by Prague Jews with instrumental music continued in 1741. It seemed to be by then a standing tradition, as can be gathered from this copper plate engraving, which depicts a similar festivity. It's a procession on the occasion of the birth of Prince Joseph II, who would become Holy Roman Emperor. Under the number 13, you see in this close-up the organist who has been identified as a Sinai Klaber. He was the cantor at the Altneuschule, known also as the Staranova Synagoga in Prague, and he can be seen playing the portative frequently, used in the synagogue. By now we have really evidence what instrument this was, and it was being given to the church when they had a problem with their instrument, so there was kind of a vivid exchange. The use of the portative organs on secular occasions by then was really not uncommon. This is not only true for the Jewish environment, but also it was used in church processions before even organs were permanently installed in churches. Still, these very early fascinations with organs in Judaism are not inspired by Christianity at all. They functioned independently. And not only there was an incident in Venice where in the 17th century an organ was to be introduced. It caused chaos and rabbinical fights, and thus wasn't pursued long term. Indeed, the early occurrences that we have just seen on slide had no long-term effect. Only in the 19th century and in Germany, the organ was officially introduced and permitted in synagogue service. What then were the sounds of the synagogue across all Jewish cultures around the earth in light of the prohibitions of choral and instrumental music, so nicely broken, it seems, in Prague? This is the text that would be rendered in a few days for the Jewish New Year. It's the Torah portion for the Jewish New Year, which stems from Genesis, the book holding the creation myth of both Judaism and Christianity, and catering to our motto, our earth. And this Torah portion we now hear being rendered in sound.
First day of Rosh Hashanah, first reading. Amen. Vadonai pakad et Sacra ka'asher amar vayas Adonai Sacra ka'asher diber v'tahar v'teren Sacra le'Avraham bein lizkunav lamoed asher diber oto Elohim ויקרא אברהם את שם בנו הנולד לו אשר ילדה לו שרה יצחק ויאמר אברהם את יצחק בנו בן 8 ימים כאשר ציווה אותו Elohim.
Since religious texts should not be spoken in the manner of everyday speech, they were read with melodic intonation. More joyous musical expressions were allowed only for weddings and the dedication of synagogues and Torah scrolls. The melodic inflection of sacred texts had no musical significance. Indeed, the melodic rendering of religious texts was prayer first and music second. Nowhere is this more audible than in the cantillation that you just heard, the ritual reading from the Hebrew Bible in synagogue service, guided by unique signs. Standing in between reading proper and singing, it is a specific form of chanting. Now, changes lied ahead in the 19th century. Indeed, the 19th century led to many changes in Jewish life and Judaism. Social rights, as a result of Enlightenment, led to changes in religious life, such as an abridgment of the liturgy, short homilies in German as a second language of prayer, and more could be mentioned, such as biblical cantillation being discontinued, congregational singing introduced, and synagogue choirs being nurtured. The once free improvisation of the chazan, the reciting prayer leader who had a strong religious function, was replaced by notated music, sang by the musically well-educated cantor. Musical performance was overall improved to make it more palatable to a public that was increasingly educated in Western art music. With all these innovations, not only new forms of Jewish music unfolded, but also a new era of Judaism that divided the community into Orthodox and Reform or liberal congregations. Now, the organ was one of the most strident markers of this division and of a new musical identity and radical change in Jewish society. It introduced controversy, or it basically was kind of the scapegoat of controversy. Vehement quarrels and debates took place, fights in almost every single community. There were rabbinical conferences that addressed the issue of the organ, and it was a subject of various polemics. Now, what spoke against it? First of all, the ban to play an instrument on Sabbath to mourn the loss of Second Temple and homeland. The fear of a Christianization of the service, because association with Christian tradition means loss of Jewish tradition and identity. By the way, this paralleled the Catholic Church in the time between 900 and 1200, where they actually argued similarly in parallel, saying the organ is a pagan instrument. It should not be introduced as a pagan instrument into the church. But back to our Jewish quarrels. One of the other questions was, who plays the organ on Sabbath and holidays? A Christian musician would pose some danger of the Christianization of the service, and then a Christian organist would not know Hebrew, the liturgy, and the nusach, the melodic style of rendering prayer in song. That was the real problem, because a Jewish musician is not supposed to work on the Sabbath, and organ playing may be considered work, unless one argues that playing organ is similar to being a chazan, a cantor who renders prayer. Now the other faction, argued differently. They said if we want to have orderly congregational singing in our communities, we need an instrument that can facilitate and support this. The organ would elevate aesthetic aspects of the liturgy. And after all, there was an organ already previously, as the Prague example has shown. So what's the big deal? Supporters of Jewish organists argued that playing the organ is a mitzvah, a good deed, and because of that, the organist should be similarly regarded as the cantor. They also argued for a Jewish organist, as only a Jewish organist is familiar with the character of Jewish music, specifically chazanut, the art of cantorial singing, the mentality of the Hebrew language, and its musical construction. Permissions issued by 2 rabbinical conferences between 1845 and 1869 led to most German synagogues or synagogues in Germany and other European countries introducing the organ, as long as they identified themselves as being liberal or reform. That would take its peak at the turn of the century, and by 1938, we can count about 200 organs being installed in synagogues. Now, what did these organs look like? And I brought a few images to kind of show you how various organ builders and the communities work together to give the organ also a Jewish look. Symbolism was introduced. You see here on the top of the organ of the synagogue of Teplice, the Star of David. On the next slide, in Königsgrätz, you see also the Star of David being incorporated in the center, just above the middle pipes. And on the next slide, you see the synagogue of Dortmund. Now, that looks like a prototypical organ, but if you look right at the middle, you see that in the middle, there is, on the lower end, below the organ pipes, the ark where the Torah scrolls are being held, and the middle part of the organ above is being constructed just like an extension. In the detail that follows, you see actually how the pipes are being bundled, and they actually kind of resemble the Torah scroll, and they're being processed around the synagogue. So there are these kind of subtle ideas of how to create an affiliation between Jewish culture and the organ. Now, what music was being played on the organs initially? At first, the organ was to accompany the cantor, the choir, and the congregation. There was no solo repertoire. But then things changed, and from very early on, as the next slide states, already by 1820, that's very early, that's before the rabbis permitted the organ officially into worship, there was an anonymous composer who created very, very simple organ pieces to be played as here for a Jewish funeral to be played. And these are very simple pieces. They're artistically not very significant, but it's kind of a first attempt to create a solo repertoire for the synagogue. And we don't know who the composer is. He might be Jewish, he might be church musicians helped out at the time. Now to the next slide. I've promised that we celebrate the 200th anniversary of birth of Louis Lewandowski, and I think now it's time to do so. A few words on Louis Lewandowski and why it's so important to celebrate his anniversary of birth. First of all, he made a significant contribution to organ culture. For those of you who don't know him, you might want to know that he was the first synagogue musician to receive formal training at the renowned Royal Academy of Arts in Berlin, the first Jew to be admitted. He was born into poverty in Poland, and only through a twist of fate, he came into the household of the Mendelssohn family, Alexander Mendelssohn, cousin of the famed composer, and he helped him to establish himself in Berlin. Louis Lewandowski did not anticipate to have a career in synagogue music. He trained to become a classical composer, after his studies at the Royal Academy, and his early works include songs, string quartets, and symphonies. Then came a severe illness, and that changed his path. He reoriented himself to become a synagogue musician and was hired to be the music director and choir master of the new synagogue in Berlin at the Oranienburger Straße, which is one of the largest, or was at that time one of the largest synagogues in Europe. Lewandowski was among the first who convincingly and clearly defined the role of the organ in Jewish worship. And a case in point is a little piece that I brought you. It's kind of just an appetizer. It's a prayer called Veha Kohanim, and it's not a solo piece. It is a recitative recited on the Day of Atonement, which comes after the Jewish New Year, where the cantor reads about the day's special temple service by the high priests, the Kohanim, and how all would fall on their faces when hearing the holy name God uttered. The organ accompaniment usually duplicates the choral setting, and I'm glad that we heard the beginning one more time, because you probably realized, hopefully realized, that Lewandowski gives the organ another role, and the role is to play ornamental passages and little notes and to enter into a dialogue with a cantor, and that was very unusual. He treated the organ just like he would treat a cantor. That was a significant elevation at the time, giving the organ a considerable role, treating it almost like the voice of the cantor. And this is not where he ended. His first opus for organ, the 5 Festival Preludes of 1871, were celebrated as a sensational musical novelty. They were inspired by both synagogue music and Western music, particularly the choral prelude. These 5 preludes were written for different Jewish holidays: Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, Sukkot, Pesach, and Shavuot. And each one is characteristic to the festival because its thematic material is taken from synagogue song that is specific to that festival. A case in point is the prelude number 5, which is composed for Shavuot, and that is my case study. Shavuot is the harvest festival, which also commemorates the giving of the law, the Torah, and it incorporates 2 cantorial pieces. One you are going to hear, the other one you will have to imagine. The piece that is really centerpiece is Agdamut. It's unique to Shavuot, it's usually chanted, and it's very unusually interpolated in the reading of the Torah. And Lewandowski used or kind of reconfigured this poem with a sense of grandeur. He took away a little bit of the kind of chant-like quality that it has. And he also uses it for different texts, and you will now hear an excerpt of it on the text of Mika Mokka in a version for Shavuot, and that is, I want you to hear the melody to then find it again when you hear the organ prelude in full.
Moshe ubnei Israel lechanu shira besimcha rabba ve'amru chulam mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai mi kamocha nedar b'kodesh nora tehilot osef pele shira chadasha shibechu geulim lesimcha al sefat hai.
You hear it's kind of strophic. There's a lot of repetition of the same melody on different texts. The other prayer is a recitation. It's very ornamental, and this is how he starts the prelude. This recitation is called Ha'el, and it serves as an introduction to many other prayers, and it records the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt, and it's proof of God's omnipotence. So when you hear the prelude that Lewandowski composed for Shavuot, right in the beginning, you will hear the Ha'el, and then I hope you pick up the melody for Agdamut. Before I say a few words about the prelude, I want you to hear the prelude right away. So we start the sound example of the prelude on this slide. So you heard in the beginning the recitation, and now we stopped with the Agdamut prayer that just set in forte. If you can attend a concert in Weilheim tomorrow in the course of the Musica Sacra International Festival, you can hear this piece in full. Lewandowski was never an organist. His general abilities as a composer and solid knowledge about orchestration must have been tremendously helpful for him in conceiving these preludes, because they are quite colorful and appealing. The significance of his pieces do not really lie, though, in their style and quality of writing. They represent the achievements of a pioneer and one of the first attempts to find a musical language for organ in Reform and liberal Judaism in tune with its time and its environment. These pioneering efforts were, after all, the very first attempt, with a few other exceptions before him, to depart from the vocal traditions of Jewish music and to develop them further. His and others' repertoire shows that the musical acculturation of German Jews was a careful negotiation between Jewish and non-Jewish elements in order to create a new musical language, commonly perceived as modern or progressive. As such, it was never geared towards full integration into the musical landscape of Germany or other environments. Rather, this new organ repertoire shows how Jewish composers sought transformation while staying Jewish at the same time.